Professor of World Politics at the University of London, Stephen Chan, joins us for more. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thanks for joining us. It was predicted, wasn't it?
It was predicted, but I don't think anyone believed that there would be this scale of victory or this scale of defeat, to put it more accurately, in these elections. The Conservatives basically lost a huge amount of support throughout the country. So the Labour Party was able to enter Parliament with a huge majority. And so it's very, very much a case now of what they can do with it. They've got a mandate. They can try to establish the policies that they campaigned on. But for the Conservatives, it's very much back to the drawing board. They have to reinvent themselves quite fundamentally.
Well, I mean, after so many leadership changes within such a very short space of time, surely the blame can't be put on the man who resigned today, Rishi Sunak.
No, it can't be. The consensus here is that he was to a certain extent a fall guy. Nobody could have saved the situation that actually began with Boris Johnson and with Liz Truss. A very great deal of public support for the Conservative Party was lost because of those two prime ministers. So Rishi Sunak probably did the best he could. It was far, far too little, too late. So as I say, he's the fall guy. He's resigned in a very, very gracious manner. And what's marked the transition is a certain graciousness on both sides. Sunak paid tribute to Starmer, and Starmer paid tribute to Sunak. So the whole thing has been done with a certain amount of goodwill, although everyone understands that the change is going to be quite fundamental.
I gave it my all were his words this morning. But what do we know about the incoming Prime Minister?
Well, what you've got to realize is that although he's not a great orator, he's not very charismatic, he's made of steel. And if he's determined to do something, he'll set about doing it. He has transformed the Labour Party. Some would say modernized it, some would say watered down its fundamental historical left-wing principles, but he's got the party into power. They've got a hugely viable mandate, and it will be a reformist government. There will be, I think, a huge, as it were, movement towards a genuine social democracy of inclusion and provision. He's got a good 5 years to do that. It's unlikely the Conservatives will come back at the end of that 5 years. So he's likely to have a 10-year term in front of him. So his determination to transform the country could come into reality.
Where would you put Labour today, Prof, in the sort of spectrum of politics?
Basically, it's centre-left, and with an emphasis on centre. It's not left in the sense that we would normally associate the term left with. It's much more in the image of some of the Scandinavian social democratic countries. Nothing radical, everything as stable as possible, perhaps everything as predictable as possible. This makes, to a certain extent, for boring politics, but very much center-left. In other words, probably not too far away from Macron in France, although Macron wouldn't call himself left in any sense of the word. But that kind of centrist government with left-wing social democratic leanings is what you're looking at in today's Labour Party in the United Kingdom.
Is it a marked departure from what the Labour Party was from, I mean, as many people would remember the days of Tony Blair, for example?
Now, Tony Blair was a modernizer as well, and he probably modernized in a way which was far more, as it were, in the image of a Tory modernizer. A very great deal of our bureaucratic oversight now is handed down from the Tony Blair era, which he in fact adopted from the Margaret Thatcher era. So the big brother is watching you type of image is what I associate with the Tony Blair administration, although many good things were done. At the same thing, many terrible things were done. The war in Iraq, for instance, being a case in point. So what you have is a departure from those years. There won't be a rush of the United Kingdom to join in any foreign wars, for instance. The big question is, what can it do for the cause of peace? And that's a big question which the Labour Party has got to come up with some answers over.
Well, I'm asking that question, of course, because I mean, during the years in which former Thabo Mbeki was the president of South Africa, they seemed to enjoy fairly good relations with Tony Blair. One, of course, wonders how the relationship is going to be like now that Labour is back in power.
I think the relationships will be good. They might even be better than in the days of Tony Blair and Thabo Mbeki. What you've got in terms of President Ramaphosa, the graciousness of his speech when he accepted that he had to form a government of national unity matched some of the graciousness that was on display today on the part of both British leaders of the political parties. But what you've also got as a very, very likely outcome of today's cabinet discussions is the appointment to cabinet of David Lammy, who will be foreign secretary, himself a black man, himself educated at my university, SOAS, the University of London, and who has got a very, very world-conscious outlook and is very anxious for good relations with Africa. I think this administration is going to be on very good terms with Ramaphosa's administration in South Africa.
Well, of course, I mean, in spite of those good relations or warm relations, I mean, trade between the United Kingdom and South Africa, and I dare say the rest of the continent even, have always been skewed in the UK's favor.
Well, basically, in the matter of trade, you're dealing with capitalist economies, of course, so that's natural. I do think, however, that there will be some ameliorating effects. I think that there'll be an increase to the continent in terms of foreign aid dispersals, something the Conservatives were quite anxious to begin retrenching. There won't be any fundamental change in terms of foreign policy, except a leaning towards questions of justice. The Labour Party has got to sort out a huge number of issues. For instance, it has a very confused approach to the war in Gaza. It has got to very, very much come up with some positive action over the war in Ukraine. So to a certain extent, relations with Africa is still something in creation. I wouldn't expect any fundamental changes in the relationship between Britain and Africa for at least 2 or 3 months while they get their act together and consider exactly what could or should be done. But I am hopeful that after about 2 or 3 months, there will be a discernible change in terms of attitudes of Britain towards Africa.
Of course, I mean, they have pledged to, ahead of this election, the Labour Party did pledge to do away with Sunak's government, the Sunak government's controversial plan to deport undocumented people to Rwanda.
Yes, that's definitely now part of the history books. And in fact, there was so much opposition to that plan that, in fact, no one was actually deported in the end. The Rwandans made a lot of money out of it in terms of down payments. That's not going to be returned. But that kind of approach to illegal immigrants, people seeking asylum, that's not going to be resurrected anytime soon in the future. There's obviously in this country recognition that there is a migrant problem. At the same time, there's going to be respect for international law and the rights of people to claim asylum. So resources have to be put into that, but not by way of sending them to a faraway country, using Africa as some kind of dumping ground for so-called illegal migrants or asylum seekers. So that embarrassment to British foreign policy, that is now part of the history books, and Starmer is not going to resurrect that at all.
Now, in terms of its place in the world, is Britain still the great nation that Keir Starmer said earlier it is?
Well, of course, he has to say that. He's got to dress himself in patriotic colors, and is right that the Prime Minister of Great Britain should be a great aficionado of Great Britain. But the reality is that Britain is not great anymore. It's a senior middle ranking power. And I emphasize both terms, senior, but definitely middle ranking. In terms of the scale of world powers, I'd have France above Britain in terms of international throw weight, and Germany certainly in terms of economic capacity. So it's there in the mix, but it's not going to be a world leader. It's going to be consulted, it's going to be important, but the days when it was Great Britain with capital G, no, those days are not going to be coming back anytime soon.
Prof, thank you so much for your time and for your insights.